The 8 Trigrams Shuffle. The year is 228 AD. On the Qishan plains of Gansu Province, 8,000 soldiers are moving in total silence, not charging, not retreating, rotating, continuously in a pattern drawn from the I Ching, the ancient book of changes. From a distance, it looks less like an army and more like a living mandala. The enemy watches from across the field and does nothing. That paralysis, that confusion, was the entire point. The problem is that no one, not then, not now, not in 2,000 years of military scholarship, has ever successfully reconstructed how this formation actually worked. The Bagua Zhen, Zhuge Liang's legendary 8 Trigrams formation, is described in the Sangguoji, the records of the 3 kingdoms compiled between 280 and 290 AD by Chen Shou. Captured Wei soldiers reportedly could not describe what they had seen. A stone labyrinth in Baxian County, Sichuan, supposedly Zhuge Liang's physical training ground, contains 64 stone arrangements matching the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching exactly. Military historian Ralph Sawyer, in his 1993 work The 7 Military Classics of Ancient China, concluded the formation was, in his assessment, more cosmological symbol than operational doctrine. The Jinshu, compiled in 648 AD, records secondary accounts of captured soldiers giving incoherent descriptions of the formation's movement. David Graff, in Medieval Chinese Warfare, published 2002, notes that no surviving tactical manual contains step-by-step deployment instructions, only descriptions of the effect. Not a single verified battle account records the 8 Trigrams achieving a decisive victory. Mainstream military historians argue the formation was primarily psychological. Its reputation alone caused hesitation. The cosmological framework gave troops a sense of divine order, of fighting in harmony with the universe itself. That's a reasonable explanation. But Zhuge Liang reportedly drilled his men in this formation for months. You don't spend months rehearsing a psychological posture. Some researchers have asked a darker question. Was the Bagua Zhen never meant to be decoded by anyone, including the army inside it? Was the confusion the point? A formation so deliberately incomprehensible that even your own soldiers' apparent chaos became a kind of camouflage? We may never know. What we do know is that the most famous formation in Chinese military history cannot be reconstructed, cannot be proven to have worked, and left behind a stone labyrinth that still has no agreed explanation. That is not a legacy of genius. That is a legacy of mystery. From cosmic geometry, we descend to cosmic philosophy, to a formation that didn't just borrow from the universe, it tried to become it. The 5 elements array. Imagine dividing your army into 5 groups and handing each one an identity drawn from the structure of reality itself. You are fire, you are metal, you are wood, you are water, you are earth. The doctrine is elegant. Fire defeats metal, metal chops wood, wood absorbs water, water extinguishes fire, earth anchors all. The commander's task is simple. Identify which element the enemy formation represents, deploy your counter-element unit, and let the cosmos do the rest. The problem reveals itself approximately 30 seconds after the first arrow flies, when no one can agree which element the enemy actually is. The Wuxing Zhen is described in the Liu Tao, the 6 Secret Teachings, a military manual compiled around 300 to 200 BC and attributed to the legendary strategist Zhang Zia. The formation assigns directional positions cosmologically. Fire units face south, water units face north, wood units face east, metal units face west. Earth holds the center. David Graff documents that 5-phase doctrine influenced Chinese military thinking continuously from the Warring States period through the Tang dynasty. a span of over 900 years, despite no verifiable decisive victory being attributed to elemental coordination specifically. The Huainanzi, a Han Dynasty philosophical compendium from 139 BC, acknowledges the friction between cosmological military doctrine and battlefield chaos, noting that the wise general knows when to set aside the stars. Tang Dynasty General Li Jing explicitly criticized formations built on cosmological correspondence as beautiful in the tent, invisible in the field. Archaeological evidence from the Changping battlefield of 260 BC, where 400,000 Zhao soldiers were killed, shows no formation pattern consistent with 5-unit elemental coordination. Historians argue fairly that the 5 elements framework served as a mnemonic, a way to organize unit assignments in a pre-literate military culture where the cosmology was the filing system, not the strategy. That is probably true. But if it was only a mnemonic, why did tactical manuals treat elemental matchups as causally real, not metaphorically, but as actual battlefield mechanics, for 9 centuries? Some researchers suggest the formation reveals something deeper, that ancient Chinese commanders understood warfare not as logistics, but as cosmological performance. The battle wasn't supposed to be won by tactics, it was supposed to be won by alignment with the universe itself, which leaves an uncomfortable question that the manuals never answer. How many soldiers died because their general was busy calculating which direction fire faces? From the philosophical plains of central China, we ride northwest, to the steppe frontier, where a formation that looked like a dragon became a death trap for the men inside it. The flying dragon spread. You are a Tang Dynasty cavalry officer and your general has just explained the plan. 10,000 horsemen will fan out across a 3-mile front in the shape of a dragon's outstretched wings. From above, if a god were watching, it would look magnificent, a mythological creature sweeping across the northern steppe in a single, fluid motion. From inside the formation, it looks like this. The rider beside you is now a 1/4 mile away. The rider on your flank has vanished over the horizon. And when the Turkic horse archers begin picking men off one by one, there is no one close enough to help. The Feilong Zhen is documented in the Tongdian, a comprehensive military and administrative encyclopedia compiled by Tang Dynasty statesman Du Yu in 801 AD. One of the most thorough records of Tang cavalry doctrine in existence. The formation required a minimum frontage of approximately 3 Chinese li, roughly 1.5 kilometers, meaning signal drums at the center could not be heard at the wingtips. A communication dead zone ran the full length of the dragon. Du Yu's own text lists the flying dragon spread as a great cavalry formation for open terrain, then explicitly warns it cannot be maintained against an enemy that refuses a fixed engagement, which described almost every northern opponent the Tang faced. Emperor Taizong's court chronicle, the Zhenguan Zhengyao compiled in 709 AD, praises the visual impact of cavalry formations in a manner that military historians, including David Graff, note prioritizes spectacle over function. Li Jing's decisive victory against the Eastern Turkic Khaganate in 630 AD, the campaign that effectively ended the Khaganate, notably did not use the Feilong Zhen. Tang commanders subsequently returned to the spread formation anyway. Mainstream historians argue the flying dragon was a legitimate tactic for flat terrain against slow infantry and that its failures came from misapplication. That is a fair defense. But Du Yu documented the failure condition inside the same manual that recommended the formation. Some researchers have suggested that Tang cavalry formations like the Flying Dragon were partly designed to be seen by the emperor, by court historians, by the enemy's scouts before the first charge. A formation that looked like a dragon was not just a tactic. It was a statement of dynastic power. Statements, unlike formations, do not need to work. They only need to be believed. The dragon wanted to look invincible. The next formation wanted to be invincible by becoming a wall. It looked perfect on paper. It had one structural problem: corners. The square wall line. The year is 228 AD, and a young general named Ma Su has been given one job: hold the pass at Jiating. He looks at his army, deploys the Fang Zhen, the square formation, soldiers facing all four directions simultaneously, and climbs the nearest hill. No one can approach from any angle without hitting a wall of men. The geometry is perfect. Then the Wei army arrives, surrounds the hill, and cuts off the water supply. The wall cannot move. It was never designed to move. Men begin dying of thirst before a single weapon is raised. The Fangjin is one of the formations attributed to Zhuge Liang's 8 arrays, described in the Sangguoji and elaborated extensively in Pei Songji's commentary annotations from 429 AD, one of the earliest documented after-action tactical critiques in Chinese military literature. Pei Songji specifically identifies Ma Su's deployment at Jiating as the definitive case study in misapplying a square formation to terrain it cannot survive. Zhuge Liang reportedly wept upon receiving news of the defeat, then personally executed Ma Su, the most consequential formation failure in Three Kingdoms history, ending an entire northern expedition that had taken years to prepare. The Song Dynasty Military Encyclopedia, Wujing Zongyao, compiled by Zheng Gongliang in 1044 AD, analyzes the corner weakness explicitly, noting that where two walls meet, the strength of neither is present. The loss of Jiating forced a full strategic retreat, meaning one failed formation decision collapsed a multi-year campaign in a single afternoon. Song Dynasty General Yue Fei's battlefield correspondence from the 1130s references Jiating as a cautionary example against rigid formation deployment. Historians argue the square formation is not inherently flawed. It is a valid last resort defensive posture used across military traditions globally, and that Ma Su's failure was personal, not doctrinal. He chose the wrong ground and disobeyed explicit orders. That is a reasonable defense. But the Wujing Zongyao documents the corner flaw in detail and still includes the formation as a recommended deployment. Some researchers have asked whether the square persisted not because it worked, but because it mirrored the Fang, the square earth, of Chinese cosmology. Abandoning the square formation may have felt on some level like abandoning the shape of the world. At least the square could, in theory, hold its ground. The next formation on this list couldn't hold itself together. The crossed spear grid lock every soldier's spear to his neighbor's. Create a grid of interlocked steel so tight that no cavalry horse will dare charge it, no infantry line will push through. You have built a wall out of living men. Then one soldier at the left end of the third row takes an arrow to the throat. He falls. Because his spear is locked to 4 others, he takes them with him, and they take theirs. The Jiaozhen, the interlocking spear grid, is described in the Taibai Yinjing, the White Tiger Cannon, a Tang Dynasty military encyclopedia compiled by Li Quan in 759 AD. Li Quan specifies the interlocking angle at approximately 45 degrees and recommends a soldier spacing of roughly 1.2 Chinese Qi. A density that military engineers have calculated allows an incendiary arrow to spread fire to adjacent soldiers within seconds. Song Dynasty General Yue Fei, in correspondence preserved in the Yue Fei Zhuan, explicitly identifies the chain collapse failure mode and prohibits the formation in his own units, replacing it with an alternating half-pike, half-sword line. Archaeological excavations at Han Dynasty battle sites along the Yellow River have recovered clusters of tangled bronze spearheads in configurations consistent with formation collapse rather than combat scatter, weapons that fell together rather than individually. The Wujing Zongyao of 1044 AD includes a modified version with a deliberate breakaway link, a designed weak point meant to prevent cascade failure, acknowledging the original formation's fatal flaw within the very manual intended to replace it. European pike squares of the 16th century, developed entirely independently, encountered the identical cascade collapse problem and solved it differently through file depth rather than interlocking, suggesting the flaw is not a Chinese cultural failure but a universal property of coupled infantry systems. Historians argue the crossed spear grid was effective in its designed role, static garrison defense against cavalry, and that Yue Fei's criticism applied to his own mobile warfare style, not to fixed-point defense. That is a fair reading. But Li Quan's own advocacy text states the formation requires absolute steadiness of every man. That is not a conditional use case. Some researchers have asked whether the interlocking grid reveals something about how Tang military planners conceptualize soldiers, not as individuals who might fall, but as interchangeable components in a machine. A formation that only functions if no one dies is not a formation. It is a fantasy of perfect order. From the garrison walls of the Tang interior, we move to the open plains of the warring states, where a formation didn't collapse from within. It collapsed because it was trying to look like the moon. The crescent moon array. On a map, it is extraordinary. Your army curves into a crescent, two horns reaching forward to embrace the enemy's flanks while your center holds. You have drawn a moon in human flesh. The enemy walks into the middle, and the horns close around them. That is the plan. Then the left horn encounters a ravine. The right horn hits a tree line. The two tips of your crescent are now 2 miles apart, facing different directions, unable to see each other, and the enemy has walked straight through the gap in the center and kept going. The Yan Yue Zhen, the crescent or wild goose wing formation, is described in Sun Bin's military methods, a text recovered in the 1972 Yingqueshan Han tomb excavations near Linyi, Shandong. Bamboo strips lost for nearly 2,000 years, rediscovered in one of the most significant archaeological finds in Chinese military history. Sun Bin's own recovered text includes explicit warnings about the terrain conditions that render the crescent ineffective, warnings apparently unheeded for centuries afterward. Sima Guang's Ziji Tongjian, the comprehensive mirror compiled in 1065 AD, records a specific Han Dynasty northern campaign engagement where a crescent formation was broken by Xiongnu cavalry attacking a single horn rather than the center, causing the entire line to fold. Military historian Mark Lewis, in Sanctioned Violence in Early China, published in 1990, notes that the crescent appears in Chinese tactical literature more frequently as a cautionary example than as a recommended deployment from the Han Dynasty onward. The formation required real-time coordination between horn commanders separated by approximately 2 to 3 Chinese Lai in a standard 10,000-man deployment, beyond reliable drum signal range in field conditions. The Wujing Zongyao's modified version assigns reserve cavalry to each horn tip, effectively patching the original design's exposed weakness with supplemental forces it was never supposed to need. Historians argue the crescent was genuinely effective against slow infantry on open ground and that its failures reflected changing military technology rather than inherent design flaw. Some researchers, however, have noted that the crescent's shape mirrors the moon in Chinese cosmological symbolism and that the Yanyu name itself invokes wild geese moving in natural formation. Was the crescent preserved in the tactical repertoire partly because it looked right, because its shape resonated with something deeper than tactics, an aesthetics of natural order that made it too beautiful on some level to retire, a formation beautiful enough to die in. The crescent wanted to embrace the enemy. The next formation wanted to absorb them through sheer human mass. It is the oldest, simplest, and most horrifying failure on this list. The human wave. Attempt. The doctrine can be written on a single stone. Send enough men forward and the enemy must break, physically, psychologically, cosmically. The shy, the momentum of massed humanity in motion, is itself the weapon. Sun Tzu wrote about Xi. Every general who read him nodded. Then they sent 10,000 men into a killing field and watched the momentum evaporate in the first 30 seconds. The Renhai-gen has no precise origin because it is not really a formation at all. It is the absence of one, the decision to replace geometry with mass, tactics with bodies. Victor Mayer, in his 2007 translation, Sun Tzu's Military Methods, and Roger Ames in Sun Tzu, The Art of Warfare, from 1993, both document the scholarly consensus that Xi was systematically misread by later Chinese commanders as justification for mass attack, rather than Sun Tzu's intended meaning of accumulated strategic advantage. Sima Qian's Shiji, from approximately 94 BC records mass infantry casualties from Xiongnu arrow volleys specifically targeting dense formations. The lethality of packed men under ranged fire was documented 2,100 years before the Taiping Rebellion. Archaeological analysis of the Chongping battlefield of 260 BC, where 400,000 Zhao soldiers were killed in a single campaign, suggests the final Zhao assault was a mass charge into prepared Qin positions, possibly the largest documented human wave failure in military history. By the Taiping Rebellion of 1850 to 1864 AD, Qing commanders were ordering massed infantry charges against fortified Taiping positions armed with early modern firearms. Franz Michael's historical analysis in the Taiping Rebellion documents these assaults occurring on consecutive days, at the same positions after the previous day's charge had failed. The Qing Hunan army suffered an estimated 12,000 casualties in a single series of frontal assaults at Zhejiang in 1854 before abandoning the tactic in that engagement and returning to it elsewhere. Mainstream historians distinguish between the human wave as deliberate doctrine and as desperate last resort, arguing that most documented failures involved commanders with no remaining tactical options. Some historians of Chinese military culture have offered a darker reading, that the persistent return to mass assault reflects the social economics of command. Complex formations required trained officers, literate staff, and disciplined soldiers. A human wave required only obedient men and a general willing to spend them. Perhaps the Renhai-gen endured not because anyone believed it would work, but because it was the one formation that didn't require the army to be something it wasn't. From the horror of the wave, we return to geometry, to a formation so mathematically precise it could only have been designed by someone who had never stood inside one. The fish scale formation. Someone looked at a fish and thought, that is how I will arrange 10,000 men. Overlapping staggered wedges, each unit tucked behind and slightly offset from the one in front. Nature's own armor, translated into human flesh. The Yulin-gen is genuinely beautiful from above. It is the kind of formation that looks inevitable, as if the universe itself designed it. From inside a fire attack, however, every soldier is touching 4 others. The overlapping tiers form a wall in every direction, and there is nowhere to run. The fish scale formation is described in the Wujing Zongyao, the Song Dynasty's comprehensive military encyclopedia, compiled by Zheng Gongliang in 1044 AD under imperial commission. The most systematic codification of Chinese military knowledge up to that point. The manual specifies that units maintain a spacing of approximately 1 bu, roughly 1.5 meters between soldiers. A density that military engineers have calculated allows incendiary arrow fire to spread to adjacent soldiers within seconds of ignition. Song Dynasty military records document the catastrophic defeat of a fish-scale formation in a Liao cavalry engagement, where fire arrows into the compressed formation created what the Songshi, the history of the song compiled in 1345 AD, describes as men unable to fall without striking others. Military historian Robin Yates in Soldiers, Weapons, and Harness from 1994 notes that the fish scale's vulnerability to fire was consistently recognized by song commanders and consistently attributed to insufficient unit discipline rather than structural design flaw. The Wujing Zongyao specifically recommends the formation for attacking fortified positions, precisely the scenario where defenders have the greatest access to incendiary weapons and the attacker must advance under fire at its most lethal. By the Southern Song period, with gunpowder weapons increasing in battlefield frequency, the formation's documented casualty rate appears to have climbed rather than fallen. Historians argue the fish scale was sound doctrine for its designed role, concentrated assault force for breaching defensive lines, and that failures came from situational misapplication. Some researchers have noted something harder to dismiss. The formation's visual elegance, its resonance with natural pattern, may have conferred a kind of institutional prestige that insulated it from tactical critique. Formations that mirror nature carry an implicit authority. The fish scale has protected fish for 300 million years. Who argues with a fish? The fish scale packed men together until fire could eat them alive. The next formation did something arguably more absurd. It put them in a line, a single, unbroken, miles-long line. The single-file march pictured 20,000 soldiers stretched through a mountain pass in a single column. The general at the front has just made contact with the enemy. He is fighting for his life. A message rider turns and rides back down the column, passing rank after rank of soldiers standing still, weapons ready, waiting. By the time the message reaches the rear, we are under attack. The front has been fighting for 40 minutes. The general is dead. The column does not yet know this. The Changshe Zhen, the long snake or single column formation, is analyzed in the Shiji, Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, from approximately 94 BC, which records Han Xin's deliberate exploitation of enemy column formations during the Chu-Han contention of 206 to 202 BC. At the Battle of Jingxing in 204 BC, Han Xin positioned forces at the rear of the enemy column first, guaranteeing the front would receive no reinforcement regardless of outcome. The communication dead zone problem is quantifiable. A 20,000-man infantry column at standard 4-man-wide spacing extends approximately 7.5 kilometers, beyond reliable drum signal range for its entire length. Zhang Liang's tactical analysis, preserved in Shiji commentary, identifies the column's information lag as its critical vulnerability and recommends it only when terrain provides no alternative. The Wujing Zongyao of 1044 AD includes a segmented column modification that breaks the formation into independently responsive sections, directly acknowledging the original design's reaction time failure 12 centuries after Han Xin documented the problem. Historian Edward Dreyer, in early Ming China, published in 1982, documents that Ming commanders encountered the identical column time lag problem in Yunnan mountain campaigns over 1,000 years after the solution had been written down. Mainstream historians argue that column formation in mountainous terrain is not a tactical choice, but a physical necessity. Armies cannot deploy otherwise when the ground forces it. That is true and it is a fair defense of the formation's persistence. But Zhang Liang documented the time lag problem and recommended against it except when unavoidable. In the 2nd century BC, the modified solution appears in a manual in 1044 AD, that is 1200 years between the documented fix and a manual that still had to document it again. Some historians have suggested the column persisted because it matched something deeper in Chinese administrative culture. An army arranged like a bureaucracy, each unit subordinate to the one in front, every position known, every rank in sequence. It was the most legible military structure imaginable. And perhaps, on some level, it felt like the right shape for a civilization that had mastered orderly hierarchy, even when that hierarchy was being massacred at its head while the tail stood waiting in the dark. The column failed because it was too orderly. The last formation on this list failed for a different reason entirely. It had no verifiable logic at all, and that somehow made it the most enduring of them all. The empty fortress strategy. Zhuge Liang's army has retreated. His city has no defenders. Sima Yi's 150,000 Wei soldiers crest the ridge and look down at the open gates. And there, seated on the city wall, playing a guqin lute, is the most dangerous man in China. He is smiling. He has no army. He has only the reputation of a genius, and the calculation that Sima Yi will believe the open gates are a trap. Sima Yi studies the scene, turns his army around, and retreats. The historians recorded it. Every military academy taught it. There is only one problem. It almost certainly never happened. The Kongcheng-ji, the empty fortress strategy, appears in Luo Guanzhong's Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written around 1400 AD, and was later codified as Stratagem 32 of the 36 stratagems. The earliest confirmed printed edition of the 36 stratagems dates to 1941 AD, though the text claims much older origins. Its compilation date remains actively debated among scholars, including J.H. Huang in his 1993 work. Historian Rafe de Crespigny, in Generals of the South, published in 1990, notes that Chen Shou's contemporaneous Sangguoji, the authoritative near-contemporary history compiled between 280 and 290 AD, contains no account of the Xiqing incident whatsoever. That is not a minor omission. Chen Shu documented Zhuge Liang's campaigns in meticulous detail. Geographic analysis of Zhuge Liang's actual position following the fall of Jiding suggests he was not at Xiqing at all. The location does not match the documented military situation. People's Liberation. Army training materials have analyzed the strategy and concluded it functions only under a specific, unrepeatable set of psychological conditions. Both commanders must have extensive mutual intelligence, and the deceiving general must have an established reputation for complexity so profound that simplicity itself becomes suspicious. At least 3 documented real-world attempts to replicate the strategy in Chinese military history, including incidents during the Civil War period of 1927 to 1949, ended with the bluffing commander being attacked. Historians argue the empty fortress is not literal tactical doctrine, but a psychological principle. Maintain composure when you have nothing, project confidence, exploit the enemy's fear of the unknown. As a philosophy, that is genuinely sound. Some historians have made a colder observation. The strategy may have survived as doctrine not despite being unverifiable, but because of it. A stratagem that cannot be confirmed also cannot be disproven. It lives in the space between history and legend, which is precisely where it exerts the most power. Zhuge Liang on the wall, playing his lute, is not a military record. It is an image. And images, unlike formations, do not need to work. They only need to be believed, which may be the most honest summary of everything on this list. These 10 formations span over 2,000 years of Chinese military history, from the Warring States to the Qing dynasty, from cosmological arrays to a man sitting alone on an empty wall. The mainstream explanation for their persistence is straightforward. Institutions resist change, traditions outlive their contexts, and men trust what their predecessors trusted. That is probably accurate. But there is something else running beneath every item on this list. A recurring tension between the desire for order and the chaos of actual battle. Again and again, Chinese commanders reached for frameworks that were beautiful, coherent, and cosmologically meaningful, and again the battlefield refused to cooperate. The formations weren't just tactics, they were statements about how the universe was supposed to work. When they failed, the failure wasn't blamed on the framework, it was blamed on the execution. Most people hear ancient military strategy and assume genius. You watch this far, which means you are willing to sit with something more complicated. That genius and catastrophe can wear the exact same shape. If this changed how you see military history, subscribe and tell us in the comments which formation you think survived the longest, and why. The men who stood inside these formations believed in the shape of their world so completely they were willing to die for the geometry of it. 2,000 years later, the formations are gone. The question they leave behind is not whether the tactics worked. It is why beautiful ideas are so much harder to let go of than they should be.